Hi, and welcome to the Health Excel podcast with me, Chandana.
And Martin.
Today with us, we have Stephen Kraus from Bessemer Ventures. Steve, it's great to have you.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're really excited to have you.
You're one of these guests we don't really need to introduce, because I think anybody who's in digital health and healthcare generally knows about Steve. And you're sitting on, I was trying to count how many boards you sit on. It looks like loads. Wondered how you're managing your time. But Steve, we wanted to jump in and spend a bit of time just get a little bit of background on you, like going back to the very early days of, pre-Yale, kind of, what was that world like? And then talk us through a little bit about kind of how you moved into Bain. And then, we just want to get a little bit of background for the listeners in terms of who you are and how did you get here? And then we'll dive into the meat of it, which is we just did a report around payer adoption of digital, and given your involvement in people like Bright and the various other companies, it'd be great to get your perspectives on it. But let's go back to the start, right? So tell us a little bit about your early years and what prompted you to Yale, and then kind of we'll just see how this rolls.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut, which, given that we're talking about insurance today, is a relevant area because for a time it was the insurance capital of I think the world. It has Aetna there, and Cigna, Travelers. So a lot of history, and frankly, grew up around that industry. I'm actually the son of my mother, who unfortunately passed a few years ago, who was a really early female leader and corporate executive. In fact, I think she was the first woman ever to run a large commercial bank. So my life story is really shaped by that, and just both having a mom who kind of broke glass ceilings, and then a father who, frankly, when I was born, decided to basically become Mr. Mom, because my mom had gotten to the workforce. She frankly had helped a lot of women around the Equal Rights Amendment. Then when that came around, she actually started a business helping consult women to get ready to join the workforce. Because at that time, because of the legislation, a lot of companies were looking for women to join the ranks. So my mom started a business, to help women do that, and then got involved in the community. And then, frankly, someone recognized her talents, which were many, and had her join their company. And ultimately, she started off in HR, but rose to, run finance divisions, consumer lending, frankly, the entire bank. And so, some of my favorite pictures of my, and then ultimately went and served on pretty large corporate boards because she was very unique at that time. There weren't a lot of women in the workforce of her position. And so some of my favorite pictures of my mother are, a board, of nine people, 8 of which are white men, and my mom, right? And I just think that's, I know we have a lot to do in America. We're dealing with a lot of issues right now around, equality and diversity and the importance of that. But I think I was fundamentally shaped by a life where, frankly, talent is genderless, is what my dad always says and what my mom would say. And so I've always had that view in my life. And my sister went on to become a very successful entrepreneur. She's a serial entrepreneur, and she herself has a lot of the embodiments of my mom. And I had a dad who, frankly, he himself was sort of a blue collar entrepreneur, but he took a back seat to support my mother and to see her be successful. So I think fundamentally as a person growing up, that shaped me deeply. And I hope, I reflect those values in the way I try to lead my life and the way I try to raise my kids, and the way my partnership with my wife works. And so I'd say that is sort of the core. The second thing is, because of her position, my mom was very involved in the community. She worked in both Hartford and then ultimately had, moved up or had to work in Boston because of, Boston is a financial center of New England. And, in every place that she was always called on by, political leaders, by community leaders, to be involved. And so I think those two values of sort of, frankly, everyone has talents, and you know, you should be accepting of all, because the world's better when it's a diverse place and there's diverse viewpoints. And also that if you're lucky like I am, and have had, you know, great privileges in my life, that it is your responsibility to give back to the community. I think those two things have fundamentally shaped me. And so, you know, I originally thought I was going to be a journalist. I actually really, I wrote sort of some professional newspapers when I was in high school and in college. I worked at the Yale. One of the reasons I went to Yale, you asked, was, you know, actually Yale is a very civically involved place, because Yale sits in the heart of New Haven. New Haven has a lot of, it's a very interesting place from a political perspective, a socioeconomic perspective. The university literally sits in the middle of the city, which has a lot of poverty, and you really can't escape it. You know, yes, it's an Ivy League, and yes, it's got the tall Gothic towers, but frankly, like when you go to Yale, you're in the middle of some really interesting town gown issues. Yale is a huge employer, not just the university, but the actual hospital itself. And so frankly, like the university itself is very involved in New Haven. You know, in many ways really good. In some ways, obviously there's some serious issues that, you know, you face. But you know, I think it drives the vast majority of the New Haven economy. And therefore, you know, many people, I think the university encourages its student body to be involved in the city. I think 90% of Yale students are involved in the community in some regard. And so it's a very active place, both in terms of community service, but also just frankly, the town relationships with the city. And so that's one reason I went, sort of hit that kind of community service. And the other thing, I was an aspiring journalist, and the Yale Daily News is like one of the best, if not the best, college newspaper. A lot of graduates of the Yale Daily News have gone on to run the New York Times, the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And so I literally went, I mean, my father tells a story, like the first place I went on my tour was to the Yale Daily News building. And, you know, when I got there, my friends in college can tell you, I wrote, you know, 4 nights a week. I would be up till midnight. I covered the town gown beat. And so I really thought I was going to be a journalist. And I thought I would graduate and hopefully go work for a major newspaper. It turned out that I lost the love of writing. I actually loved, I loved interviewing people. I loved hearing their stories. I loved doing investigative journalism, but I actually lost the love of writing to deadline. Because, you know, every night you got to hit the deadline. Your editor edits down the story. It's a little prosaic, right? You write sort of who, what, when, where, why. And, you know, that just sort of the formulaic piece of it I just got tired of it, unfortunately. But I actually think there's some things that I learned in journalism that very much apply to my job today. It's not a straight line to how I got to venture capital. We can talk more about that, but actually a lot of things you do in journalism, you know, trying to get to the core of an issue, figuring out how you understand someone, figuring out how you make them trust you to tell you things that they probably shouldn't tell you. That's a lot of what you do in diligence. You know, I hope I'm a trustworthy person, but you're also trying to make people feel comfortable to sort of give you insights into the company or into, you know, a reference on a person. And I think some of those skills I learned in journalism. So that's how I got to Yale. And that's sort of a little bit about me. And then from there, the road to venture capital is not necessarily a straight line. So we can talk more about that if you want to.
Perfect. Yeah, let's just pause there for a second, because I want to come back to your mom, and without trying to age you, give us a sense of what type of time period you were talking about in terms of her being an active executive.
Yeah, I was born in 1976, so I'm 43. Which you can tell by my gray hair. It's some people think I'm older than that. But she, when I was 2, she entered the workforce. So this is 1978. Wow. But very quickly she rose up, and so by the early to mid 80s, she was one of the corporate leaders in Hartford, and then by the late 80s was sort of one of the leaders in New England banking. And so her rise is very, very fast. I mean, she graduated from Mount Holyoke, to give you an example, which is an amazing women's college. She got into Yale Law School, but her mother at the time, because this is how different times were back then, her mother said, you know, you should probably go to Katie Gibbs Secretarial School instead, because, you know, you're going to get married, but you want to be able to maybe have a job. And so, like, my mom, you know, the world in which she grew up, and her mother was amazing, by the way, because she was a single mother, which I think also shaped my mother's life. But so she had to be strong and independent, and she was sort of the oldest child in the family. But you know, she, for the first part of her career, she really was stay at home with my sister and take care of her, and then also was active in the community. But ultimately, that just wasn't enough for her, and frankly, that just you know, that's a great life for many, but for her, she wanted more. And so her talents ultimately pretty quickly took her up the ranks. So my formative years as a kid were, frankly, my mom was working, although she always made a habit of getting home and, doing flashcards with me for quizzes, and then would go back to work after I went to bed. So, I just don't know anything other than having a working mom and that sort of role model.
So in the late 70s, that would have been it would be unusual today, but very unusual back then. What were the characteristics, the values that she had that got her that success, that led her to kind of running a bank? If you were to kind of distill it down, what did you observe that, the traits that she had that really helped her get to that?
She's very strong. I think that was fundamentally shaped by her life, her young life, where her father was unfortunately suffered from issues of alcohol and ultimately passed away. And she had to be, in some ways, as the oldest child, she had to be, there for her brother and her sister and supportive of her mom.
Yeah.
So she was strong, very strong woman, but not strong in any kind of bravado way, just like an internal strength and sort of, that willingness to just move forward. And I can't imagine the roadblocks she faced, the discrimination, the comments, but she just had to, I'm gonna get through it. I'd say that's number one. Two, she was a great listener.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody says that. My wife says that. Everyone says that they would wish she was still alive for her kids, because she just had an amazing way of listening. She always said God gave you, one mouth and two ears for a reason, right? And so I think she could draw people in, understand them. She would remember what they said. She spent a lot of time listening. And I think that ability to receive and not transmit and take that information and use that as a tool to understand people, to engage them, to motivate them. She was exceptional at that. I think she was a really good mentor, not to a lot of women. I mean, I can't tell you when her funeral, or she's won a lot of awards, how many women come up to me and said, your mom, literally shaped my life and, got me to where I'm in. And for women, for men, she was just a very good mentor. And I think that's because she really cared about people. So
yeah,
spent a lot of time doing that. And those would be the traits that I think were exceptional.
Yeah. So you had that around you as you were growing up, and then you said, okay, I want to go down, I want to be a journalist, and you get into it and you enjoy talking to people, but then this kind of constant deadline is just takes the joy out of a little bit. And so then you decide you're going to go on a different path. Tell us how you get not the straight line. Nobody goes to VC straight line, or very few. So tell me how you.
Yeah. So I didn't really know anything about business. I mean, we talked about it around the kitchen table, because my mom obviously was in business. My dad was a blue collar entrepreneur. My sister, I told you, was an entrepreneur. My sister, by the way, is 10 and a half years older than me. Okay. So she's like a second mom to me, and we're the only two children. Right. So, she was a lot older when I was young, and she was starting her career, building her company. So we talked about business, but I didn't know anything about it. So when my junior year, I kind of burnt out on writing, journalism, I was like, holy cow, I got to figure out something else to do. And so I sort of said, Janet, what do I do? And she's like, oh, go learn about business. Well, how do I do that? Right. And so she said she had worked in a consulting firm herself coming out of college. And she said, consulting firms, and my mom was obviously very helpful and guiding me. Consulting firms are a great place to go. Yeah. And learn about business, meet really talented people. And so I just applied in my junior year for internships at a few firms like McKinsey and Bain and BCG. And I was lucky enough to get an internship at Bain. Honestly, I think it's because one of my sister's friends from business school interviewed me. Like, I really didn't know anything. I guess I have some charisma. I can chat. I probably talk more than my mom ever did, but I did get an internship. One of my sister's friends was one of my finalist interviews, and I think I did okay. And I just really liked it. It was fascinating to me. It was kind of like, I imagine what a law degree is in some ways, because it's really intellectual. You're focused on a lot of different businesses. You're never bored, but also had fabulous people. Like, some of my best friends still to this day are from my Bain days. And so it was sort of like, Bain has this culture of like, work hard, play hard. and you'd work really hard hours, but then you'd be around all these amazing people and you'd want to go have like a drink with them, or go do a cookout. And so it was just a really fun place to be, both intellectually and advancing my skills, but also socially for 2 years out of college. And it's actually there where I learned that I loved healthcare, because I worked on some industries that I just had no interest in. Like I did a case for waste management industry, and I actually worked on the foibled AOL Time Warner merger. I'm definitely dating myself now, but like this was one of the most disastrous mergers ever. I think they had like 3 consulting firms working on the whole project. It was like just a huge integration. And so that was really boring to me because I didn't give a hoot about any of those industries. But ultimately I found my way to healthcare. And one of the first clients I worked on in healthcare was Johnson & Johnson.
Okay.
Which is a company that has obviously historically a great reputation, right? High integrity, has both therapeutics as well as consumer health unit. And I just really loved it. Like I was like, oh wow, this is the industry. I finally found something that sort of was business minded, but also sort of hit upon my kind of do-gooder, part of what I was looking for in my life. And I was like, oh wow, healthcare is awesome. Like I can be around really smart people, because obviously a lot of people in healthcare have advanced degrees, right? I can, be in an industry that's growing and interesting and has politics involved in it, right? In terms of the regulatory aspect of it. So that sort of hit on some of those things. And then it also can be in a way that, advances your, career economically. And so I sort of just honed in on that at Bain and did a bunch of healthcare cases. And that really was great. And then my next stop is very random. So I told you this is a winding road to VC. I'll eventually get to how I got to VC, but I had served on a board of a charter school in Boston, actually was the chair. And I did that outside of work because I was really interested in, what charter schools can do for kids who come from, impoverished backgrounds or underserved backgrounds, and can give them sort of a really high education. I was very proud of the school I was involved with. But one of my co-board members, who's become a friend, knew that I was looking for what I wanted to do next, because I wasn't going to be a career consultant. I knew that. I didn't want to do that. And he said, oh, Steve, I know you're interested in politics and, the community. One of my really good friends is running for governor in Massachusetts. Would you be, and she was a Yaley, her name was Shannon O'Brien. And would you be interested in potentially meeting her and seeing if there might be a fit? Because at this time I was 24. I didn't have a family. I thought, heck, why not? My mom always told me, actually, and this is one of the best things my mom told me was, when you're young, explore a lot of different things. Yeah. Because it's the only time in your life that you can do that. And frankly, that's what makes life so rich, right? Ultimately, Steve, and she believed in me deeply, like you will get to the place where you'll find what you want and you will be successful. She had great faith in her kids, but take the time to explore. You can do it. I was lucky. Again, I'm very lucky.
Great advice.
Yeah. And so,
well, can I also just add, it's refreshing to hear from you that consulting is really fun, because you always hear like the most negative stuff. So that's great. Really refreshing.
Yeah. But anyways, I ended up working on that campaign. She hired me. I was her first employee. Okay. And Shannon was a woman candidate. We actually ran against 4 men in the field. She was a moderate Democrat. She really did a great job of sort of defining her message. She was the sitting treasurer of the state, so she had a good financial background. And we won this very contested Democratic race. And we ultimately ran against Mitt Romney, who people know, obviously, who's now the sitting senator of Utah, but ran for president. But before that, he actually, in a very close race, beat us. Ultimately to become the governor of Massachusetts. We lost. Turns out that our running mate, our lieutenant governor candidate, was a fellow named Chris Gabrielli. And Chris Gabrielli was a fellow who founded Bessemer's healthcare practice. And so when I was on this campaign, I saw Chris and I was like, that was like the first person I saw who's like, wow, this guy's like my mom. He's like super talented, like cares deeply about what he does, the community, super smart, like a great, he had all these traits. And I was like, I want to be like that guy. And, we lost the campaign, and actually Bain was nice enough to give me a leave of absence. They were going to welcome me back. And I was about ready to go back to Bain. And Chris calls me up because obviously he wanted to be lieutenant governor. He lost. And so he wasn't going to be serving. And he's like, would you like to come work with me? And so ultimately, that's the winding road to how I got to Bessemer. journalism, consulting, politics.
Fantastic.
Through a random chance, I met the fellow who hired me and who was the partner that I ultimately worked for at Bessemer as a young associate. And so anyways, when students at HBS or Stanford Business School ask me, how do you get into VC? I always say, honestly, my story is not one to follow, but that's how I got here.
Yeah, but it's all about people. It's the two jobs have been about following people that you believed in, right? So yeah, great.
And also that behind every successful woman, there are many great men.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely agree with that.
Great stuff. So we're going to switch over. You've been a Bessemer for, it looks like, about 16 years.
Yep.
And as I mentioned at the start, you have been involved and are involved with some of the most interesting companies in digital and kind of disrupting that space. And so kind of could change the conversation now. So Chandana, do you want to jump in and maybe talk about what we found so far in terms of our report and kind of then?
Absolutely. Steve, I know you've invested in Bright Health, and that company interests me particularly as it relates to, so our report essentially explored how far are US health plans in adopting digital, right? Are they investing in, partnering with, and just their attitude towards change, right? And honestly, some of the responses were quite positive. I'll say that. I think I was more cynical walking into this process, and I was it was refreshing, I guess, what I heard. Do you believe, just based on your experience with Bright and therefore an understanding of the industry, that there is something like a successful formula for successful innovation in the plan space?
I think that we see, so if we're talking about, I think your report did a nice job of laying out, 50% of the market. By the way, it's a huge market, right? So 50% of the market is controlled by the incumbents, right? And then there's another 50%, which is kind of the long tail, which includes, as you guys do a nice job laying out, local plans, blues, which are, basically local plans, as well as some new starts, right? Some new startups. And so I think we need to talk about the two differently. Maybe that's even three. You've got the incumbents, large nationals, the blues, and then you've got sort of the, let's say the new startups, right? I think as it relates to the incumbents, there are I think bright spots, but I don't think there's like one entity who has nailed it in totality. I'd sort of point to the incumbents. Maybe there's sort of three, and I'm sure I'll leave some out, so I apologize, but I kind of think about like the United Optum, right? Yes. Who's probably the most advanced when it comes to pushing on value-based, pushing on the integration of, payer and provider. Obviously, they've acquired a bunch of different providers, everything from urgent care to surgery centers, right? To, even, very advanced primary care or risk-bearing groups across the country. Right. They also are pretty advanced when it comes to the adoption of digital and technology through Optum, right? Which are two things that you hit on in your report. How far we are behind as an industry. I think you call them laggards in terms of digital adoption. Optum, I think, is the farthest of the payers, and I think they're also pushing the farthest on value-based. I think Cigna Ventures is actually an interesting company in that I kind of feel like they are doing a lot right now under Tom Richards and Cigna Ventures to really work pretty innovatively with a lot of these new digital health. Either you can call them point solutions or full stack vertical care solutions, things like Livongo, the companies in behavioral health and musculoskeletal. I've seen them and I've worked with them where they're sort of thinking about, okay, how can we be creative in reimbursing these companies, right? Both through our ASO, self-insured arm, but also on the fully insured side. And so I think what I appreciate about Cigna Ventures is really pushing their thinking around, and Cigna itself around, hey, we have standard CPT codes, but some of these things aren't set up for standard CPT codes. If you're using chat-based function to interact with patients around a behavioral health condition as sort of a digital front door, right? So that not everyone's going to a costly therapist or a psychiatrist. If you're using that chat-based function, like, how do you pay for that, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not the same as having a visit. And Cigna's been pretty innovative in thinking about how do you bundle a bunch of chats or a bunch of interactions and make them the equivalent of a CPT code. And I think that's that kind of thinking that we need to see in the industry. And then finally, you have like Aetna and CVS, right? Which I think is a grand experiment, which is still very much TBD. But I don't think I could leave them out because just the size of that behemoth and the fact that, you know, frankly, it's a little bit different, right? Whereas I think Optum is very far along on the sort of enterprise side. And yes, they have care providers. Like CVS is a retail. I mean, talk about consumer. Like CVS is a retail. They are a consumer-facing business, right? And so I think the potential of having such a strong consumer, you know, retail footprint on basically every main street in America, and how do you take that asset and then parlay that into sort of better medical management?
Yeah,
that's a grand experiment, which we are in the early innings of, and I have no idea how it's going to play out, right? So I think those are like the nationals and what they're doing. None of them has nailed it, but each of them has really interesting experiments going on.
Yeah, I'd agree. And so maybe let's talk about some of the newer players, right? Like Bright Health and Bind and the rest of them. What do you think that they're doing differently that'll help them stand out?
Yeah.
Is it just the fact that it's more a la carte, D2C, or something else?
Yeah, well, so I think you have to put Bright, and I'll talk about Bright because I know them the best. But we could talk about Devoted or Oscar or whatever as well. You know, what I think Bright realized is a couple things. One, and it really plays on two trends, which you talk about in your report: consumerism and value-based care. I mean, those are the two sort of North Stars of Bright. And what they realized is that, you know, with the advent of Obamacare, which has been given such a bad name in American politics, at least one side of it, but frankly was a fundamental piece of legislation that's transforming our healthcare ecosystem, and I hope is here to stay. You know, the idea that individuals could buy their own insurance, could take money, whether it was subsidized by the government or their own money, and buy insurance. And by the way, do so at the scale of 10, 12 million people. That's fundamentally transformative, right? As we talk about moving the healthcare system to a more consumer-based economy, you basically, the way you get the consumer to first get involved is actually to make the first choice, which is what insurance plan am I going to choose? Okay, and so Bright realized that this trend had come apart. It was founded by very smart, experienced healthcare entrepreneurs who've partnered with, you know, technologists and said, okay, consumers are now involved in the American healthcare economy. So what does that mean? Well, we know in every other part of the economy that consumers, if given equal choice, what they feel is comparable, you know, product quality, they're going to choose on price, which is something that you guys talk about in your report, right? That we generally buy the cheaper thing if we think it's, you know, relatively equal in terms of quality. Well, Bright realized that, and they said, okay, so the way we'll win in this marketplace is if we have the lowest unit cost, but also have comparable quality. So how do you do that? So what Bright said is, we're going to go into markets. They started in Denver, Colorado, and we're going to partner with one health system in the market. Okay, in Denver, Colorado, we partnered with Centura, right? Probably the number two, maybe sometimes the number one, but someone who wants to gain market share. And what we're going to say to that system is, we're going to give you all of our members if you give us really discounted rates to the BUCAs, to the Blues, United, Cigna, Aetna. That's the acronym BUCA. And so what did that do? Okay, so we give them all our members. We get the lowest unit cost. In most of our markets, we're either the lowest cost plan or the second lowest cost plan. But we also partner with a high quality care provider. So the consumer realizes they've got good quality, they've got a full network. Yes, it's narrow, but they've got the full offering of all the specialties they need, and they get the lowest cost. But on top of that, the reason it becomes value-based is because we partner with one provider, right? For the first time really in healthcare, we have a payer and a provider who are totally aligned in the member experience, in the care management, in the quality of service that they provide the customer. And so literally Bright, members of Bright's, you know, medical team and members of the physician group that run, you know, the health system, which we work with in every single metro area, are talking with each other on a daily, weekly basis to hotspot and to take care of patients who might be trending the wrong way. And so not only do you have a low cost product offering, but you frankly just have a better product that is very value based, right? And so this was very unique. And I'll just say the reason we can do this and we have sort of a moat around what we do, there will be other competitors, there are other competitors, but the reason that United and Cigna and Aetna can't do this is because United, Cigna, Aetna, their business has been, and many, billions of dollars of profit have been made on the backs of employers, right?
Yeah.
Of selling employer-based insurance. That's the way our healthcare economy was set up years ago. And it's a very profitable business. But guess what most employers want? Most employers want a broad network, right? They want to be able to go to see any doctor. They don't want to have to be limited to one single health system. And so it's very hard for Aetna and United and Cigna to say to, partners in Massachusetts, for instance, which is a very high quality institution, hey partners, we're gonna have a separate product where you're not involved. Like that just doesn't work in terms of the negotiation. And so Bright realized that they had this market entry and that's what they've taken advantage of.
And that's interesting because you basically try to create a KP-like model where there's the payer.
It's KP, it's Kaiser in a box for the rest of the country.
Yeah. Without actually having to build up that full enterprise. It's interesting. I want to touch on the value-based care because you see, obviously, we're all hearing how hospital revenues have been hit significantly with COVID, right? And all the elective procedures, all of this is not happening. So what do you think is going to happen to this? Will it just still remain this fairy tale concept? Are we going to drop this now because we are not making enough money to talk about value-based care?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of the first things I thought about, in terms of when COVID hit and the impact that it had. Obviously, there's a lot of short-term pain, start with, the casualties that we've had and the situation that we're in and the effect it's had, economically, psychologically, all of that. That's first order. But then, obviously, our health systems in America are just getting crushed, right? And frankly, the only positive of it for them is I think people have a new appreciation for the importance of healthcare workers as frontline workers and as frankly heroes. But then the third, that was my second order, which is, gosh, what a toll this is going to take on health systems and how many are going to go out of business, and especially in rural areas where there's not a lot of access. That was sort of the second order thought I had. And then third order thought I had from sort of more of a long-term effect is exactly the one you said, which is this going to slow down what I think is ultimately one of the two ways we bend the cost curve is either, and I think we got to do both, get consumers more involved, because we've talked about how consumers tend to drive down price in economies, and two, fundamentally change the incentives of the game that's played in healthcare, right? Move the incentives to outcomes, to management preventively and sort of longitudinally and proactively in terms of care, and not necessarily to reward, hospital visits or even, physician visits that aren't necessary. And so value-based care is a very important, I think it's a multi-decade march that we're on, but I worry that this period of time where there's a lot of pain, that there's going to be a setback. And I just don't know right now, to answer your question, where we stand. I think there are some physician groups across America who frankly have made the investments in technology that you need to do and training, frankly in financial systems and care management systems that are still marching along, ChenMed, Aledade, Oak Street Health, right? Village MD, a lot of the risk-bearing provider groups in California that have existed for decades. I think those guys, those groups, which often tend to be physician-driven, and so necessarily aren't part of the whole machinery of a big health system, I actually think they're going to do fine, because frankly, the nice thing about value-based care is there's actually a lot of upfront cash that you get. And so, if you manage your business well, and by the way, you hit the outcomes, you can get paid on the back end too on that. So I think there are a bunch of groups who are in decent position, but yeah, I think health systems, except for the very well funded and the very advanced that are on, which are very few that are truly down the curve on value-based care, I think we probably will have a hiccup here. That is my fear, just because there's just not enough resources to invest in a lot of things you need to do to get ready for value-based care. The big question is, the government is 50% of payments in healthcare, as we know. And so, I don't say this a lot. I'm obviously already talked about my background. I'm a Democrat, but the one thing that the Trump administration, I think, has done well, maybe that's not totally fair, but one of the things they've done well is, I I think, around healthcare innovation. I was very worried that the transition from the Obama administration, which was exceptional and had folks like Bob Kocher and Andy Slavitt and lots of leaders in our industry, to the new Trump administration, I was worried that a lot of the value-based work that had been done was going to, you know, be derailed. And honestly, under Seema Verma's leadership, under, you know, Adam Bowler and now Brad Smith, frankly, they've been even more aggressive on promoting things like value-based renal care and primary care first. And, you know, they've got a lot of initiatives to promote this. And so while we may have a hiccup in terms of, you know, health systems readiness to take this on, I think the government, as we know in healthcare, is a major driver of incentives. And so I hope they continue to march down this path and continue to push these initiatives and reward people who are going to move us towards a value-based system.
Yeah. I mean, so it sounds like it is positive. There's just a hiccup right now in the interim. So what, I mean, I guess just to, as we get closer to wrapping up, what would you put your bets on now during COVID for what elements of health innovation will actually last and make an impact in the future?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think we're focused on really 4 main areas at Bessemer. You know, we've done a lot in our past around, one thing I'll say is I think our industry has come a long way in 10 years. And you know, a lot of us are, you know, tend to be hard on ourselves. And, you know, healthcare is such a laggard, as you were, I mean, it's embarrassing, right? I mean, where we are in terms of technology adoption versus some of the other industries we look at Bessemer. But, you know, 10 years ago, we have to remember that like less than 25% of doctors had an EMR, right? And it was because of fundamental regulatory change, which the HITECH Act basically said we're going to pay doctors to adopt an electronic medical record. And now that number is like 95% plus, right? That's a major fundamental change. And yeah, we can all crap on EMRs and their, you know, bad UIs, but like we're capturing data. Like we didn't do that 10 years ago. And that's fundamental. Like I always say to my partners, if, you know, this is like the SAP or Oracle moment for enterprise software, right? That happened in every other industry in like the 80s, right? You're talking about the 2010 period in healthcare where we actually were adopting SAP and Oracle-like systems. Yeah. If you could invested $1 or $1,000, whatever the number is, back in SAP and Oracle, back in the 80s, you would be a very rich person right now, right? And so that's where we are in healthcare from an industry perspective. So anyways, that's all to say we did a lot of investments successfully at Bessemer in the EMR space. And I actually thought that roadmap was going to be, we call it sort of investment areas roadmaps. I thought that roadmap was going to be played out because frankly, that's not a greenfield market anymore. It's a replacement market because 95% of people have a system. But then came this really important piece of legislation, which by the way, got a little bit lost in COVID, which was this interoperability legislation, which you guys talk about in your report. And frankly, it was announced right around COVID. So it didn't get a lot of attention, but it's been worked on a lot by the administration. And that's really important because that basically says to the EMR companies, and by the way, to their customers, to the health systems and payers, no. We're not having closed systems. Like we're gonna modernize the healthcare IT infrastructure, just like every other industry is. You're gonna have APIs that developers can pipe into. You're gonna provide open access to data, right? The fax machine is no longer gonna be the main modus of communication in healthcare. Still 75% of healthcare communications today occur by fax, but that's because it's closed systems, closed architectures that don't talk to each other. That rule to open up those systems and to allow for free flow of data and use of that data by really smart technology developers, that's gonna be fundamentally transformative for our economy. And so we weren't going to do a lot in what I call the digitization of the back office, save for this interoperability rule, which I think is a huge area for potential investment and where we already have a few investments and we're excited to make more. So that's sort of one bucket. Once you do that, you can automate the industry, right? And this is where, you know, you hear AI and machine learning and computer vision. And yes, those are buzzwords at HIMSS and what have you, but they're really important. Because there's a lot of things, like healthcare is the most labor inefficient business in America, right? And there's a lot of things that you can automate. For instance, we have a company called Qventus, which is all involved around patient discharge and flow in a hospital. And we've all been in a scenario where, you know, we've had a loved one in the hospital and the doctor says, okay, your mom or dad is ready to go. They can be discharged clinically. but then you sit there for a half a day or maybe in a full day, occupying a bed because a lot of things didn't happen. Well, what Qventus does is it looks upstream. It basically takes data from a lot of different systems in the hospital and says, oh, wow, Mrs. Kraus looks like she's about ready to be discharged, probably within the next 6 hours. Let's make sure her prescription is filled. Let's make sure her DME order is filled. Let's make sure she's got a sniff place to go to, right? And in many ways can actually automate some of that, or at least nudge the frontline care workers to get the process going. And so there's lots of examples of AI and machine learning and computer vision that can be used in healthcare once the data is free and liberated through interoperability to basically make our industry more efficient. So that's kind of a second area that we're focused on. The third area is, and you couldn't have done our third area without having made the investments in the infrastructure that I just talked about, is now we can talk about digitizing the front office care, which we think of about as the delivery of care, right? And this is using things like telemedicine, but by the way, you have to have a fundamental EMR layer below the telemedicine. You can now do prescription fills and testing at home. And so we right now are very actively involved in investing in companies that are taking a full stack approach to providing virtual and digital care in specialty areas. Obviously, the greatest success story so far in this is Livongo. It's now a $11 billion company, I think, pretty amazing, being very highly valued. Partly because they're focusing on a huge, expensive condition, right, diabetes, but partly because they're just providing a better offering, right? People used to stick themselves and take their blood sugar and do it kind of an analog way, and Livongo made it digital, and then they wrapped around care to it, and and just made for a better experience for diabetics, right? And so we've invested in a company called Hinge Health, which I think you referenced, which is doing the exact same thing for musculoskeletal care, basically automating digital physical therapy so that you don't have to go to a physical therapist's office. You can actually do it in your own home. We're focusing on behavioral care and automating that, because obviously in COVID, that's a huge stress area right now, mental health. And there's lots of ways that you don't have to go see a therapist in person. You can actually do it virtually, and you can actually chat with a coach and, obviously help yourself get through this period of time and deal with those stressors. So that digital delivery of care is a big roadmap for us, and we're really actively involved. And then finally, value-based, which we've already talked about, is a fourth roadmap for us. And so we're very interested in talking to any business that's focused on value-based care. So that's sort of where I think the opportunities are over the next decade.
Makes a lot of sense, right? It's very practical, operational efficiencies, and gift wrap existing solutions to make them smarter and just easier. So yeah, no, that's awesome. That was great. I mean, I know we wrote the report, but each time I talk to someone about it, and with you today, I've learned so much more.
Unfortunately, we're almost at time, so this could go on for another hour, but unfortunately, we're going to run out of time. Steve, we always ask our guests one question, and it's if you weren't at Bessemer, you weren't investing in healthcare in another universe, another life, what would you be doing?
I will be involved in some way in public service. I don't know what that'll be. That can be anything from, focused on helping state or local leaders on healthcare or national leaders. I love healthcare. That's, I think that's, as you probably heard, that's my passion. So I think giving back in some way, it could be, involved in community organizations. It could be teaching healthcare, entrepreneurship at a university or a business school. I think the second act of my career will be involved some way in hopefully giving back, whatever that may mean.
Very good. And you're already doing some of that, right? You're already teaching entrepreneurship in Harvard, and you're already in Boston Children's and involved there. So you're already doing a bit of it. So it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for taking time out. And sign of a good podcast for us is when we talk very little and the guests talk. So,
yeah, sorry. I should listen more to my mom, but I had a really good time. Thanks for all that you guys do for the industry. It's and the report's awesome, so I hope everyone reads it.
Great.
Thank you. Well, great to have you, Steve.